I'm Pierre Hencart, and I'd like to tell you about otters in my neighborhood in Annapolis, Maryland. We live on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay, on the tidal Severn River. Otters were never something I thought I'd ever see out our living room window. That all changed one January morning in 2012, when my wife Danielle called out to me, "Hey, there's something big sitting on our pier float." She was right, and I grabbed my camera and went out on the deck to get a better view, only to see that critter jump in the water and swim away. But as luck would have it, that critter swam over to the shoreline opposite our house where we watched what you're seeing here. No question, this was a river otter, which was vigorously digging in the sandy beach exposed at low tide. This otter then turned and gave us a curious display, raising its tail and butt wagging. We would later learn that this was a classic otter scent marking display, which turned out to be rather brief. But not long afterwards, our otter returned to the water and swam away. My only other encounter with a river otter had come about 7 years before this, when we were hiking with friends along the American River in California's Sierra Nevada foothills. Looking down at a steep section of rapids, there was this otter sitting on a rock calmly eating a fish. I guess that otter encounter got me to thinking that river otters only lived on fast-flowing freshwater rivers like this, never thinking they would be in the brackish tidal estuary where we live. That first otter sighting at our house really got me wanting more, and while it's a slowly developing story, I've got more to show you. 5 years after that first otter sighting, one January morning we found tracks in the snow on the float where that otter first appeared 5 years previously. Those tracks showed something had gotten up onto the float and crawled up alongside my rowing shell. At one end of the float, there was a clear paw print suggestive of an otter coming up from the water. While it was frustrating not to have seen it, another otter visit was the only reasonable explanation. At this point, I'd been reading up on otters, and I learned that otters tend to be nocturnal in populated areas. A year later, one January morning in 2018, we looked out at our snow and ice-covered cove, and we saw this impressive array of tracks running across the cove towards our pier. But most strikingly, there were lots of smooshed sliding tracks in the middle, and otters are well known to enjoy belly sliding. You can see that belly sliding in numerous YouTube videos like this one. Otters are famous for their playful nature, and that seems to be the only explanation for this kind of snow belly sliding. Looking at the cove's far shoreline, we see tracks leading up to the takeoff point onto the ice, where they're headed over to the open water on our side of the cove. What a shame to have missed all this, but it probably happened in the dark of night. A week later, I set up a motion-triggered wildlife camera looking down at the float where we had previously seen otter tracks, and it caught this otter on the float with its camera light, which apparently scared it into departing. All in all, we had confirmed that otters were at least semi-regular visitors to our cove in the winter. 3 years after this, we looked down at that float on a winter day and saw tracks in the snow. Some of these tracks may have been raccoon tracks, but when we looked closer and found fish heads, it was clear that otters had visited again, and I bought a new wildlife camera with night infrared lighting that animals don't see. On one night the next month, that wildlife cam captured 3 separate visits by otters on that float, one of which had 2 otters up at once. We got our all-time great daytime look at an otter family in January 2022. It started when Danielle saw an otter eating a fish out on the edge of the ice, and this time my video camera was ready. That otter had caught a small fish, but was taking some time chewing it into swallowable pieces. A couple minutes later, a second otter popped up with a sunfish in its mouth and immediately started eating that bigger fish. Meanwhile, a third, smaller otter appeared behind the first one and started nuzzling it as if asking for a piece of its fish, which by that time was pretty much eaten. After that first otter went back into the water, the little guy went over to the other otter, nuzzling to ask for some of his sunfish. But after getting no response, he groomed himself. Soon a fourth otter appeared with another small fish. I was eager to learn more about otters after witnessing that family meal on the ice, and I found this YouTube video from the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. It describes otter latrines, locations where river otters gather to poop and leave scent marks at sites near the water. These are otter communication hubs, as otters check scents at latrine sites to see which other otters have been in the neighborhood. This Smithsonian website provides advice on how to find otter latrines by finding otter scat, which is little pieces of fish scales and bones remaining after scent marking. Since we seem to have semi-regular otter visits in our creek, it seemed we might have an otter latrine nearby, and I really wanted to find it. But looking at these scat images, I doubted I would ever recognize anything like this on my regular kayak outings on the creek, and I pretty much forgot about finding otter scat or latrines. As luck would have it, 6 months after seeing those otter scat images, I found something quite similar on my neighbor's pier. I saw an initial scat-like pile there in July, but it washed away, and I was skeptical it was otter poop. But then 3 months later, more scat-like piles appeared on that pier, leading me to install a wildlife camera on the pier to record possible otter visits. For a week after mounting a camera on the scat pier, I got this capture. After climbing up onto the pier, the otter looked at the new camera, but then cruised the pier planks, sniffing all around and checking the barely visible scat piles. After a brief smell check, this otter sat and looked out at the creek as if expecting company. But in less than a minute, it returned to the water. About a week later, on a foggy night, the camera captured another brief otter visit. This time, the otter did some belly rubbing on the pier planks, then moved to serious plank sniffing like the first one, but this time it moved to a classical scent-marking dance, similar to that shown in the Smithsonian otter latrine video. A couple days later, there was another very brief otter visit with only some plank sniffing. 3 weeks later, the camera got another brief otter visit with sniffing but no scent marking. We again see him belly rubbing the planks as if he wanted some previously deposited scent marks to rub off on his fur. The first half of December included 7 visits by single otters, including 2 in one night about an hour apart. All included vigorous sniffing of the pier planks. Many also showed rolling and rubbing on the pier planks, and in this one you see scent marking as well. Since otters spend most of their waking hours in the water, maybe it was no big surprise to see heavy rain didn't prevent this otter latrine visit. One would think that scent marking in a downpour wouldn't work, but who knows? After several brief visits by single otters in the first weeks of December, at the end of December we see one otter on the pier going through the regular sniffing, rubbing, and quick scent marking behaviors. It then seems that he's looking out to invite a friend to join him, and one climbs up from under the pier. Otters travel in loose groups when foraging for fish, sharing good fishing locations, but also meeting up at latrines like this. We're now into January 2024, when we see 4 otters spending about 5 minutes at the latrine with the sniffing, rubbing, and scent marking activities seen before. We now see otters grooming their own fur, but also some examples of otters grooming each other. It's likely that these 4 otters are a family group consisting of the mother and her 8 to 9 month old pups, possibly including the father. At this stage, they're all about the same size. Now it's 10 days later, and we have a couple of inches of snow, and we have another 4 otter visit, this time lasting over 10 minutes. We initially see 3 otters recently arrived on the pier, each eating a fish. In one case, a small fish in the otter's jaws is still alive, and it flips briefly onto the pier before being devoured. After eating the fish, they go into their routine otter behaviors of sniffing, belly rubbing, scent marking, and grooming, all in the snow. At some point, one of the otters jumps into the water and we see at least one climbing back onto the pier. Then they move to the covered section of the pier with no snow, where they carry on, vigorously grooming and nuzzling each other for some minutes. These videos show the highly energetic otter social behavior, always fun to watch. After that snowy 4-otter visit, the camera captured only 7 brief single otter visits to the pier in the 4 months of February through May. 2 of those were in daylight, allowing a better close-up look at otter details. While most showed otters briefly sniffing the deck, after January there was no clear scent marking. Even if otters had abandoned our pier latrine site, my other wildlife cameras have recorded their visits to the marsh and beaver dam at the Saltworks Creek headwaters, about half a mile from the pier latrine. In January, my camera on the beaver dam captured this otter entering the beaver pond, but that was the only otter capture at the dam. In June, my camera in the Saltworks marsh captured this otter eating a fish. And in July, that marsh cam captured this otter family visit. So otters are still visiting Saltworks Creek, even if they aren't stopping at the pier latrine. It turns out that I did have another otter experience in the spring of 2024. In April, Danielle and I drove south to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. We stopped at the Oregon Inlet, a narrow gap in the sandy Outer Banks connecting the Pamlico Sound with the Atlantic Ocean. As I walked out on the fishing pier on the south shore of the inlet, I was amazed to look down on a river otter eating that nice-sized striped sheepshead fish. Unlike the small fish enjoyed by our Saltworks Creek otters, finishing this meal was going to take a while. But here was a river otter eating that sheepshead in ocean water. We learned that river otters are fairly common in Pamlico Sound, and here we're many miles away from anything you could call a river. So that name river otter is truly misleading, and these wonderful animals are very adaptable.